Good morning, and thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Julie Todd. I'm a senior librarian with the City of El Segundo. And this morning's talk is part of our Living Library series, which is a collaboration between ESMoA and the El Segundo Public Library. It's inspired by the Human Library, which was created in Copenhagen in 2000. And the Human Library encourages people through conversations to break down stereotypes and foster empathy. Thank you all to community members who sent in such meaningful questions for our guest speaker this morning. With limited time, we are only able to select a small representation for Dr. Lanyi to address. At this time, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones. And now I will introduce our guest speakers. Mr. Paul Lanyi. Paul is a proud 17-year resident of El Segundo. He grew up on the East Coast and moved to California in the late 1980s. And Paul is married to a lifelong Californian, and their 12-year-old son attends El Segundo Middle School. They live in the house that his wife's uncle built in the 1930s. Paul is a marketing contractor by day and has volunteered in the city, wanting to give back, including serving on the PTA and Park Vista board. Dr. Valery Lanyi. She was born in Baja, Hungary in 1929, and Dr. Valery Lanyi experienced growing up in a time the Nazis removed the Jewish people from their homes, sending them away on boxcar trains, either become slave labor on farms or into Auschwitz or Birkenau to never be seen again. Dr. Lanyi attended medical school in Budapest, Hungary. Once in the United States, she completed her second residency to work at NYU Langone and her entire career in rehab medicine. Dr. Valery Lanyi still lives in the same apartment that she moved to in 1970 on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Please help me welcome her to El Segundo.
Should we go?
All right.
Can you guys hear me? All right. Hey, thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you especially to Barbara, Julie, and Sam from the city for putting this on, and the folks from El Segundo TV or El Segundo Media for helping make this happen. We really appreciate you all being here. My mom is 92, going on 93, so we're going to do a little bit of a tag team here. I may recount to you some of the stories I heard as a kid, but this is going to be interviewing back and forth, and then we've got some questions that Julie's going to feed to us that came from all of you. But before we go there, I just wanted some quick facts about the Holocaust, because this is something that we read about, but Mom's going to talk to you about. So the Holocaust was a state-sponsored mass murder of millions of people. These were Jews primarily, but queer people, people with disabilities, and other persecuted groups during the regime during World War II. And it's called the Holocaust. It comes from the Greek word holocauston, which refers to a sacrifice by fire. And if you've read anything about this, you're going to know that people were exterminated. It wasn't pleasant. They were put on fire, they were gassed, etc. So my mom is from Hungary. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. There were 565,000 Hungarian Jews killed by the Nazis. So have any of you ever been to Atlanta or Sacramento or Miami? Just put up your hand if you have. Okay, imagine one of those three cities being wiped off the face of the earth. Okay, Hungary, when she was during World War II, was about 10 million people. That's roughly about the size of LA. So imagine if Sacramento wiped off the face of the earth, and you imagine just what happened in Hungary itself. Starting in 1939, the Nazi government ordered all Jewish people to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothing, and this was meant to isolate them and make it easier for them to be identified and targeted. And this is a crazy piece of information. Ultimately, 2/3 of all Jewish people living in Europe during World War II were killed by the Nazi regime and their supporters. Just think about those numbers. This is very real, folks, and it is in some ways happening again today. Mom will talk about that. So to my mom, Dr. Valery Lanyi, introduce
Good
yourself.
morning. I'm Valery Lanyi. I'm a retired physician, and don't be surprised that my choice of what to do in medicine was the rehabilitation of the disabled. That was my specialty, and I have always felt that I paid something back.
So let's go back to the very beginning and maybe a little history lesson. Where is Hungary? Anybody know where Hungary is? Anybody visited? Okay. Where is Hungary?
Well, Hungary is on the south-north, no, the southern part of what became Hungary. There were between the Germans and the other smaller European countries. If you get a newspaper these days, you can see pretty well of where it is located.
So think about Austria here and Ukraine here, in between. So right today there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians pouring across the border into Hungary. Where is Baya in Hungary?
Well, Hungary was occupied various times by various groups of people, and Baya actually ended up being the lowermost, the most southern part of this mixed population. The majority were Hungarians, and then the variety of smaller offshoots, some Austrians, some very few Romanians, but basically an area where all the middle class people live. Baya has become the head, I guess the best way to describe it, the chief part of Hungary at one point when the decisions as to how Second World War had changed things around. I hope I'm making myself clear, and ask me if I don't.
So Baya, B-A-J-A, we all say Baja, but Baya is about 2 hours due south of Budapest. And there were, back when she was a kid, 16,000 residents. Anybody know how many people live in El Segundo? 16,000. So think about Baya as your town or your home, if you will. What was Baya like as a kid? Were you going to the movies every day, driving around in cars? Was it modern?
I went to school a lot. One of my aunts was a teacher, and so she wanted to make certain that nobody thinks that she's making a special person out of me, because I'm related to her, so she was meaner than anything you can imagine.
Was it a modern town, an exciting place?
No, it wasn't a modern town. It was physically very interestingly located. Is that the wrong sentence? Interestingly located in that there was just behind the Danube, and depending on which way you came toward town, you saw more or less water. But it was basically a town where you spent lots of your time on the water when you didn't study.
And being 16,000 people, you knew everybody knew you.
Well, they knew me even more than I knew them, because my grandfather, who I have never met, was a very popular gentleman. And so I would walk down Main Street, and they said, "There goes old Paul's grandchild." Hence somebody called Paul in this room.
What did your family do for a living?
They're what is now, I guess, called a special market for any kind of fashionable and needed things. So, in other words, housework and
So it's like a small department store.
it became a department store, and that word became fashionable.
Okay.
Yes.
Were you or your family devout Jews?
No, not particularly.
You didn't go to Hebrew school or to the synagogue weekly?
Well, it depended on what school I went. There were schools that I went to that were Catholic schools that insisted that the Jewish children don't respond to every question in Catholicism, which was the main religion, but also to how to say it. I lost my.
We'll come back to it.
Yeah, right.
So,
okay.
so at that time, Baya was 96% Catholic, 4% Jewish. Did you consider yourself first and foremost a Jew or a Hungarian, or how did that combine?
I was a Baya. I was like you are New Yorkers or not.
Californians?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so being Jewish was not an important part of your everyday life.
No. But I did go to temple on high holidays. My mother always had a new gown.
Mother always said what?
Always had a new gown.
Yeah. So let's be clear, high holy days, like 4 days a year, so
Yeah.
not very devout.
Right.
Okay, so 1939-ish rolls around, and you were told you're a dirty Jew.
Right. And have to wear a
Star of David.
Star of David. And my father had begun to walk to the main street in the back road, but had to walk across the main street itself. And it was an interesting way of him having been received by the man who essentially ran the town.
So let's clarify this. What she's saying is he couldn't walk across the town square. He was not allowed to do that anymore. Someone who had spent his whole life in Baya was now forced to walk the back streets because he was a dirty Jew. So you grew up in your mom and dad's house, but
Yeah.
you eventually had to move to the ghetto.
We were pushed out of all the areas that were non-Jewish. And the ghetto became an artifact into which anybody could walk in and take anything away from. Am I making myself clear?
So what you're saying is you left your house on Whiting Street, were put in a certain place, compacted with
Yeah,
other people,
right.
and you had no rights.
None.
Okay. So talk about the changes that happened, for example, with the Jewish men in Baya at first.
Well, most of the men, short of 30 for some strange reason, were taken away into camp, and from the camp in a train where you could see them go.
So all the men in town, all the Jewish men were rounded up,
Right.
taken to the train station, put in boxcars, not first-class trains, but
Yeah.
for cattle, and taken away. And
Right.
do we know where they went?
Most of them went to Auschwitz.
Okay. So if you haven't done any research on Auschwitz, I recommend you do. But think about people in town in El Segundo being pulled out of their homes, marched to the train station, being put in boxcars, no water, no food, no nothing, no idea of where they're going, and then being taken to a death camp.
And
Think
pushed,
about-
so sorry,
and pushed.
pushed together so that it was, you didn't know whether you were coming or going after 3 days of neither water nor, if you excuse my expression, getting rid of the water.
So you and how did
My
you end up
mother-
leaving Baya?
My mother and my grandmother were also taken into that train.
So you and your mom and your grandmother were put on in a boxcar, doors slammed shut. Did you know where you were going?
We had no idea.
Did you have any food, water, anything?
None of the above.
And where did the train stop and what happened then?
Just outside of Vienna, it stopped, and a group of people were taken off the train, and we were just happy, my mother and I, to be able to breathe again, to begin with, and be on open air. And from there on, we were put into little, first one big group, and placed in a house of sorts, and then a group, and eventually several smaller groups were divided and placed outside of this camp.
So let's just clarify, you and your mom and your grandmother all were put in the boxcar.
Right.
But what happened to great-grandma, your grandmother?
My mother went to get her when it came to the lucky opportunity to be given a home, so to speak, a temporary one. And when they did get there, my mother headed into the train to go and get her mother. And one of the Germans looked at my mom and said, "Who's she to you?" And she said, "She's my daughter." And she said, "Then you belong with her." And we never saw my grandmother again.
So think about this. You've seen it in the movies. This is what happened to someone you now know. You were on the train trip for 3-4 days?
Yeah, roughly.
Okay. And then you were in this first camp, and then you were sent to a work farm camp, essentially,
Yeah,
right?
right. And that was an Austrian shop owner who was selling greenery. And
Produce.
he knew nothing about farming, and he got himself 11 Jews who also didn't know anything in farming. Good thing about it is that you don't ever farm. You don't ever really starve if there is something that you can dig carrots out. So I couldn't look a carrot in the eye for 10 years after this little event.
My mom used to say that you had to be really stupid to starve on a farm camp, because you could always take a potato out of the ground, stick it in your tunic, and shove it in the one fireplace that was in where you were living to eat. How long were you there?
I was 13. I was 13, but I was very tall. And so people thought that I was an adult, which was, I guess, my greatest luck. I was able to share a bed with my mother, suchly, head, toe.
How long were you there?
11 months. And then they started trying to move us into real camp. Excuse me.
So for anybody here, well, imagine being 13 years old, pulled out of your home, and you have nothing, and you don't know what's going to happen to you that hour, that minute, that day. And so they were there for 2 years. And you told me that, and maybe I'm wrong, that the farmer didn't necessarily mistreat you or beat you or anything like that, but you knew how the war was going by how he treated you.
Well, he was listening to Radio Free Europe, and we knew what it said, depending on how he treated us, which was never really, he never touched any of us.
Right. But again, you were not there by choice.
No.
You were ripped from your home.
Right, and I was 13 years old. I was neither coming nor going. All I wanted to do was study, you guys.
So you described it to me as a lost adolescence.
Absolutely. I went from being, albeit very tall, youngster, to being an adult, and there was something missing in your life, in my life, that was growing up, of being able to go from just a girl to somebody who I smoked by the time I got out of there, because there were people who heard about those poor Jews, and they brought cigarettes. That was very famous then, to be helping yourself dying faster and in worse ways.
So you were there for about 2 years, call it.
Yeah,
Who
roughly.
liberated you from the camp?
Russians, and they were so proud of themselves that they had taken us and done us so much good, and then 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, they were our owners.
So we'll talk about that in a second. How did you get, so it was a couple 100 miles back to Baya. How did you get there?
Most of the time walking. We got groups together and kept walking until somebody came and gave us something.
So imagine walking from here to Santa Barbara and back. That's what they did. And so you got back to Baya, and you had, shall we say, a house guest.
Oh, yeah. That by then we had 2 Russians.
So they had 2 Russians living with them, and the funny story Mom always told was that we'll call one Ivan. Ivan would confide to them, "Shh, don't tell the other guy, but I'm Jewish." And then the other guy, Leonid, would say, "Shh, don't tell Ivan, I'm Jewish." So there was
And then one of them brought their son over.
Didn't know that. After the war, did you go back to school?
I couldn't wait. I arrived home on Friday night late, and Saturday morning called the school that my father went to and asked if I could please come back to school on Monday, because that's all I wanted to do, is learn, and I'm still trying.
So let's skip forward a bit. So years later, you moved to Budapest in a communist regime. You went to medical school. You married my dad. Why did you decide to leave Hungary in 1955? 56.
I was pregnant, and I was not going to give life to a child who is going to be a prisoner, essentially, the way I was when I was little. And so...
You described it to me as an escape to democracy.
Absolutely. And we were caught on the border and put into a round, I don't know how to describe it, a room where people are gathered, and they showed us where the different groups of people who were helping were located. In other words, don't go near where the Hungarian at that
secret police
point thought that the secret police was various a group of families. And then I had the mixed pleasure of giving a bunch of children medication so they don't cry while we're trying to go across the border. And when we arrived on the Austrian border, inside Austria. It was the first time I took a real breath, I think. Not until then,
So-
because I finally felt free.
So let's elaborate on this story a little bit. So Communist Hungary, 1956. If you leave, you're a traitor. And mom and dad,
Left.
she was pregnant with my brother, said they got to leave. So they basically took the train to the border, got captured, and they were told, "There's the border. You need to go back to Budapest. There's the border. There's the fence, but don't go anywhere near that." So the next day, the door miraculously opened early, and they went to the border, and they were with some other people. And mom, being a doctor, there was a group of people, and there were kids. And my mom had to give chloroform to some kids, babies, small kids, to get them to sleep and not cry. Because if they cried, they'd all be dead. So imagine the stress of being pregnant, and it's not like you got measuring tape, spoon to figure out exactly how much to give the kids. So I can't imagine how frightening that must have been. All right, so you moved to New York and you've lived there ever since.
Yes.
Do you consider yourself an American first or a Jew?
An American.
Much as you thought of yourself as a Hungarian first.
Well, it was a very complicated thing to live in a small country that is cut off from a somewhat larger small country, and then Hungary being itself separated, and then finding yourself once again in a place where you have to make sure that you don't take a wrong step to the wrong side.
So we're going to get to some questions in just a second. We've been talking about what is it that she wants people to understand about the Holocaust. And one of the things that mom wanted to make sure people understood was it was men. It wasn't just men. It was men, women,
Children.
kids, teenagers, people of every size, age. There was no discrimination. It was you're either a dirty Jew or you're not. We also talked many times about her not understanding how people could be considered different just because they're a different religion. So I'm just curious, how many people here are left-handed? Okay, imagine tomorrow someone comes to your house and says, you're left-handed. You're out. In fact, you're going to get killed or you're going to get thrown in a concentration camp. That's how indiscriminate it felt for her. We've also been watching the news a lot lately and looking at what's happening in Ukraine. And mom has described it as a madman. It's a madman who wants to own it like Hitler wanted to own the whole world. Would you say that's pretty?
Yes.
Okay. So the last thing before we get to the Q&A is, and thank you everybody who sent in the questions. The reason we wanted to do this was, first off, we wanted you to hear from someone who was in it. So some people say it's a lie, some people say it didn't exist. This is your living proof. The other part of it is, we all have a responsibility to prevent such kind of genocides in the future, well, in the present and the future. So it's not just them who it happened to, but it's people now that you knew.
It can happen to anybody. Yeah.
You want to go with the question? All right, so Julie's going to ask some questions that everybody sent in, and we're going to try and answer them.
Okay, so the first question comes from Eileen Bell, who is an El Segundo resident. What were the political and interpersonal warnings present in the time leading up to your family's being sieged by the Nazis? And then the second part of the question, did people believe these warning signs, or did they believe that it couldn't happen to their country, their family, or them?
I don't even know how to answer this, actually. You have to realize that this has happened, it can happen, and it is happening. And the route to all these little side trips come with blood and crying or not.
Yeah, I think part of this is the incrementalism that starts with one rule, where Jews couldn't be doctors, then Jews can't be lawyers, and Jews can't be this, and Jews can't be that. Then you have to wear a star, and all along, as my mom has described it, and other relatives, they say, "We're Hungarians. That it's not going to get worse," but it did,
and it has got rid of huge groups of people, well ones, young ones. I never saw my father again. So it was a very mixed kind of situation.
There are 11 million people in Los Angeles County. 6 million Jews were exterminated. So think about it. If half of LA just disappeared, and we're gone. Let's go on to the next one.
Okay, and the next series of questions come from Christy Zeman's 10th grade honors English class. Currently, they're reading Night by Elie Wiesel. Next question, Abby, grade 10. How did you feel? Were you forced to move out of your, how did you feel when you were forced to move out of your home and not able to take anything that you couldn't fight back without getting killed? What were your thoughts throughout that time?
I understood only part of what was going on. I was only 13 years old, and I never really had an adolescence. To this day, there is a hole, and I'm very old by now.
Okay, let's go on.
And Melina, grade 10 also. What did it feel like to be persecuted solely because of your religion?
It was not to be believed. It was just hard to me not being me. That it was because I was born in a particular group, I'll never be the. Eventually, I managed to survive, but I could have just as well been killed then. And in fact, there was at one point when we were waiting for a train to come in to pick us up, those of us who survived some of the situations like I did at that farm. And I hope I'm making myself clear that there was this guy, his field, and then these 11 people who were his, I don't even know what to call them, I guess, belongings.
Think about it. So they were slaves.
Yeah.
They had no rights, no abilities. They couldn't choose anything for themselves. Again, think about it here in El Segundo, 16,000 people. Imagine if 10% of the population were just taken away. They had no choice in it. They were just gone. And that's what you need to remember. Next question.
And the next question is from Judson. Were you constantly living in fear?
Yes. Indeed, there was no, I didn't have a right to go to the policeman down the street and say somebody looked at me unkindly is the understatement. You were not a person anymore. Yeah, sorry.
So Shiloh asks, what was your life like after the Holocaust? And were you able to live a normal life, or does your traumatic experience always hold on to you?
I never could have that wonderful time that many of you are now having, and that's called adolescence, where you can just grow up based on what your knowledge and what your desire for knowledge is. and complain about it if you don't like it.
So growing up, we'd sit down to eat, and we'd have the food on the table, and within 2 minutes, Mom's food was gone.
Right.
And I never really understood it till I was a teenager, and I said, "Why do you eat so quickly?" She said, "Because if you didn't eat quickly, you might not get food. And you never knew if you had 30 seconds to eat or 10 minutes, so
Right.
you just stuffed your face." She eats much more slowly now, though.
Milo asks, how did you feel about surviving the camp? So many people died, and I wonder how you felt wondering if they would survive or not. And when they did you have survivor's guilt when they didn't?
Come again, the end of the sentence, I'm sorry.
How did you feel about surviving? And so many people died, and Milo wonders how they feel, wondering how you feel, wondering if the others survived or not. When you found out that they didn't survive, did you have survivor's guilt
Yes.
about the others?
Yes, indeed. And it was always a situation when you didn't quite know of where you belonged in this group. Neither fish nor fowl. You were a person, but you weren't a person. You knew, because of having gone to school and a wonderful family, of what the good life is, and at the same time there was this hole that remained a hole, in essence. So answer it?
Yeah, so just a quick story. My wife's son and I went to Hungary to visit family a few years ago, and we took a train from Budapest to Vienna, and we crossed the border. We stopped at a siding, and my mom, who's a very calm person, started crying, and I said, "Why are you crying?" She said, "This was where the train stopped, where she was taken off." And she hadn't thought about that place in 30 years, 40 years. But that's a little bit of the survivor's guilt right there, right? I got off the train, my grandmother did not, her grandmother did not. The guilt of that. The fact that all of the men in the town were taken away, all the Jewish men in the town were taken away and never seen again. It's incomprehensible to us to have had all those people ripped away and not be able to see them. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, you just can't compare the situation that was and the situation that is, and unfortunately seems to be happening again.
And Kaya asks, did you have any hope during this time, or did you abandon all optimism? If not, what motivated you?
That's an almost unanswerable question. How could I live with that, and how could I separate myself from it? You just need to develop your own route of how to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And Izzy asks, how did it feel when you realized that you were free?
Come again?
Izzy wants to know, how did it feel when you realized you were free?
Very mixed. Because there was a hole in my life for good that could not be replaced. On the other hand, I could understand what people did go through. I don't know if Paul told you, but I'm a retired rehab doc. I spent my life in the rehabilitation of the disabled and traveled all around the world, working with other people with similar background and interests.
So I think part of what has motivated Mom is the ability to go help other people. and it's in rehab medicine. So what's a rehab doctor? So many of you have been across the street to Davis and DeRosa. If you go there, typically a doctor is going to prescribe what needs to be done. This is what Mom did, and she would help all sorts of people. I remember sitting at the dinner table one day, and there was a story about a bomber who wanted Puerto Rico to be independent, who bombed, for some reason the bomb went off and he lost an arm and a leg. And Mom said, "Oh yeah, I treated that guy today." You did what? And she helped very famous people, but people from literally every walk of life. And that was with a constant sense of wanting to give back and to help, not just to have taken from society.
Casey asks, what is the most valuable lesson that you learned from the Holocaust?
The love of those that are close to you. I think the most valuable and my desire to add to it something professional, and I hope even for my children.
We watch the news regularly, and particularly in the last few weeks with what's going on in the Ukraine, and we're constantly talking about what can we do. And Mom's asked, what can we do? We have family in Hungary still, and they are going to the border, taking food and water and clothing, and some of them have Airbnbs, and they've turned them into homeless refugees. And brother-in-law has an advertising agency, and he's turned the conference room into a place for people to sleep. So I think we're getting close to time. I think part of what Mom has told me she wants to impart is it has happened, it will happen again, and it is happening. And it is all of our responsibility to observe, to object, to protect, and to help people at every turn. And that's why we're grateful to Barbara and Julie and Sam for having brought us here today and to have had these conversations.
And I hope you're not feeling that I'm dumping things on you so that I'm adding something to what you plan your life like. Is that too fancy schmancy?
I think we're good.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Lanny and Paul, for being here, and for all of you for listening to their story.
Thank you.
Thank you.